My, yeah, the first thing I was supposed to say was we are recording the event. How we plan to use the recording is basically to post it on YouTube and on the Classics and/or Mahindra Humanities Center, the Humanities Center here at Harvard websites or channels. Attendees have no obligation to appear or speak in the recording. You can turn off the video and participate under an alias if you choose. And if attendees decide to participate in an identifiable way, we will need you to, I guess, implicitly authorize the use of the recording as we have described it. And it sounds more formal than I usually sound, maybe, but or legalistic, but that we decided to record as we did with the last seminar, which I did on the Nazi uses of Virgil, particularly through the figure of Victor Perschel. And this is the Mahindra seminar on the classical traditions, which is co-chaired by Adrian Staley and John Hamilton, who's on leave this year, and myself have decided to devote some attention to the historical ways in which our field has been used or abused in the furtherance of systems, races, fascist, Nazi, and so on, as a way of historically understanding those uses, but also as a prelude to our own ability as classicists to push back and to frankly be more vigorous about furthering the field as a field which is not itself implicitly participating in those sentiments, but like any 1500, 2000 year period, creates elements, literary, cultural, architectural, philosophical, whatever, which can be diverted and used and abused. So that an obvious candidate to join us in this process, and I'm not at all saying how, or I don't know how the next 35, 40 minutes will go, but Curtis Dozier seemed an ideal person to have join us. Adrian Staley himself in the fall will do something on, maybe just a quick word, Adrian, on what you plan to do for our current group.
Yes, hello, can you hear me?
Yep.
Yeah, I will do something about Leni Riefenstahl's Olympia movie from 1938 about the so-called Hitler Olympics. And this will be about the reception of classics, or let's say the ideal construction of classics through the prologue to this movie by Leni Riefenstahl's movie. There's still no title yet for this event.
Thank you, Adrian. So that look forward to that in the fall. And any of you, by the way, any particularly classicists with expertise who are interested in this enterprise, I think Adrian and I would be interested in hearing from you if you're not too far away. Obviously, I imagine we'll be doing hybrid versions of this in the future. So please be in touch with us. But with no more preamble, let me introduce Curtis Dozier, who's an assistant professor of Greek and Roman studies at Vassar College. He received his PhD from Berkeley in 2008, and his work was essentially on Quintilian and classical rhetoric, which may at first sound dry or not relevant to today's event, but in fact, that's not true. As we all know, the uses of rhetoric, the art of persuasion, are intensely involved with both for good and for less good, the uses of any topic. So he's been diverted slightly from that project, but we'll get back to it and looks forward to getting back to it. And the diversion has come partly through this website that we'll be hearing about in a minute, Pharos, the lighthouse, so doing justice to the classics, basically documenting, collecting, and responding to appropriations of ancient Greece and Rome by hate groups. So that goes to the core of what this seminars within the seminar that we are engaged on this year we'll be doing. So maybe Curtis can tell us a bit about his forthcoming work, which will be a monograph precisely on white ethno-nationalism and its uses. And then he'll get back to Quintilian, but I don't actually believe he'll ever get back to Quintilian in quite the same way, having done this amazing and important work that he's involved in now. So, and I think Curtis, the plan is that Curtis will go to a bit before 5, maybe that, but 10 or 5, whatever. But then we'll have a good hour if we need it for questions. I'd ask that you use the yellow hand when it comes to question period, or put a question in the chat if you would rather do that. And then I will call on you. So I'd ask that for now, all of us, including myself, mute ourselves, and that we stay muted also through the discussion and Q&A period, unless we're speaking. And so again, I guess we're already being recorded, but if you don't wish to be recorded or want to turn your video off, do so. I think we didn't get bombed last time we did this, and I haven't seen Alison. I don't think there's been any abusive posts on the last version of this. Of course, Curtis is taking us more directly into January 6th territory. So we look forward to that. So please, a round of applause, whatever that looks like, for Curtis Dozier. Curtis.
Thank you very much, Richard, for that kind introduction. It's an honor to be here today at Harvard and the Mahindra Center, and thanks to Richard for helping me organize this visit, and for Alison Lynch and Laura Sargent at the center for their support too. And yeah, I'm going to be talking to you today a little bit about the work I've been doing on my website, Pharos, documenting hate groups using Greco-Roman antiquity, but more about kind of what I'm thinking about in terms of treatment of the topic of Athens in the monograph I'm working on right now. And I quick introduction to the site. I have a couple links to it there on the first slide, and my social media handles if anyone wants to follow us there. I launched the site at the end of 2017, and since then we've gotten some great coverage in the press, some bad coverage too, but there's no such thing as bad publicity, and have reached an international audience, which has been really gratifying and humbling to see. When I launched the site, I didn't know what would happen, and I think the reach we've had around the world shows that it's filled a need and struck a chord, excuse me, beyond classics professors and their students. So that's been really exciting to realize and be a part of. Richard, of course, mentioned the January 6th attack on the U.S. Capitol, and I think when we think of appropriations of Greco-Roman antiquity by hate groups or violent insurrectionists, we think about the things like the Capitol attack, where as you can see in this slide from some images, there were rioters wearing Spartan-style helmets, or someone waving a Molon Labe flag. It's behind the Gadsden flag in the upper right there. And these people kind of conform to a stereotype in America of what a racist looks like, I would say. Kind of yahoos operating at the fringe, probably not very sophisticated understanding of Greco-Roman antiquity. I think if we just take it at face value. Oops, what's happening here? If you've been following the phenomenon longer, you may think of the so-called Unite the Right rally in 2017, which was a time when, for many Americans, the sort of vitality of the white ethno-nationalist movement in this country became a source of public attention. Their promotional poster for the rally had SPQR on it as one of the logos of the various white supremacist movements that they were trying to unite there. You may also be familiar with the group Identity Europa, which again around 2017 was putting flyers on college campuses using classicizing imagery to promote white supremacist messages. They haven't flyered at Harvard as far as I know, but after this talk, I'd encourage you to go on the Crimson webpage and put in Identity Europa and see what you find there. And if you're familiar with the history, as I assume many people are, and Richard, of course, spoke earlier about it, and Adrian's going to have a course on it next year, it sounds like. You're probably familiar with the Nazi and fascist admiration for Greco-Roman antiquity and their use of it. Now, all that history is important and what's going on is important, but I kind of think that the more I've worked on this material, the more I've felt that these examples can kind of lull us into assuming that these appropriations don't have very much to do with us and our work as classical scholars. Maybe sure, we might say there are these regimes that used Greco-Roman antiquity for evil, but they are sort of located in the past and are among some of the most extreme and violent genocidal regimes in history. And if we look at the examples from today, as I said, they sort of look like only superficially engaged with the study of antiquity. But what I've realized, and I didn't know this when I started doing this work, but this is where what I've kind of become most interested in, is this whole ecosystem or a whole world of white supremacist thought that does not conform to the stereotypes we have in this country of racism. It's been described by scholars who work on it as highbrow white nationalism or the intellectual radical right, and it's populated by people who don't look like the Capitol rioters, but in fact look a lot more like me. They're mostly men. Many of them have PhDs. They hold or have held academic appointments. They speak foreign languages. They've lived abroad. They're very good writers, and their publications feature all the accoutrements and performance of academic discourse. They if they're going to say molon labe, they're going to cite where in Plutarch that saying is recorded, and they're going to give you a citation for that. Or if they're going to mention Aristotle and his politics to support a anti-immigration, anti-diversity ideology, they're going to cite the politics and tell you where in the politics you can find Aristotle's beliefs. They often include bibliographies in their works. Their writings are argument driven, just like we would find in academic journals. And this area of white ethno-nationalism online, I think, is very, very interesting and worth learning more about, because I think that if we approach this phenomenon, this is to sound paradoxically, but if we approach it with a kind of openness without defensiveness, it makes it much harder to say that these people are not us. It makes it much harder to say this has nothing to do with us than I think is comfortable. And this is really my overall interest in highbrow white nationalism, which is, I sometimes call them the thought leaders of white ethno-nationalism. And what I'm going to talk to you about today is their invocations of Athens in support of racist politics. I think Athens is a pretty provocative case because in general, Athens is something that we as a discipline are, generally speaking, kind of proud to claim as part of classics, say. You can contrast this with Sparta, which has received much more attention, I think, including from me, right? They were wearing the Spartan helmets at the Capitol attack. We can contrast this with the way Sparta is a source of inspiration for white supremacists, because the hierarchical, hyper-militarized enslavement economy, xenophobic state, that has an obvious appeal to racists who, shall we say, see those features as desirable aspects of a society, not as problems. But I guess what I'm trying to say is it's relatively easy, I think, to study Sparta from a critical point of view, because the aspects of Sparta that are represented in the sources, at least, are out of line with at least the stated dominant culture of the United States. Now, of course, militarism, a hierarchical caste system, xenophobia, those are in fact features of American national identity right up to the present. But at least the stated ideals of liberty and justice for all means that we don't sense as much intersection between Sparta and our values. It doesn't threaten us very much if they admire Sparta. But here, I don't think we need to get into whether they are working with the historical reality of Sparta or only with the so-called mirage of Sparta that's created by the ancient sources. Sparta kind of obviously aligns with white ethno-nationalist politics. So I think the fact that they also admire Athens and invoke Athens in support of their politics is more surprising and more challenging to us, especially when we think of Athens as being considered by many, let's say, popularly considered a kind of prototype, if not archetype, of a democratic state. So first, I want to kind of just show you some of the things they say about Athens and what their interest in Athens is. Now, so this is an article from a site called the Occidental Observer, which you can, if you can read the slide, it brands itself as white identity, interests, and culture. And they write about Athens, recognizing that democracy is not, generally speaking, something that, as they put it, men of the right are interested in or admire. They see Athens, or just democracy in general, as individualism and belly chasing, or effeminacy and obesity there. But they basically say that that may be true of democracy, but Athens is a special case, because they argue the democratic aspects of Athens, the belly chasing and individualism, were tempered by what they call the wider Hellenic virtues that they describe as communitarian, competitive, spirited. These are all kind of buzzwords of the politics on these sites that I read. And you know, they basically say that these Hellenic virtues we don't have anymore, but they actually would kind of make democracy work better than it does now. So that is, they say, don't confuse Athenian democracy with what we have now. This is an article on the blog of Arctos Media, which is a major publisher of European nationalist thought and translator of nationalist thought into English. It's run by a prominent Swedish white supremacist. As this article says, the ancient democracy is not like what we have now. And he makes the first point he makes is that how much more exclusive the franchise was in Athens than in modern democracies. Similarly, here we have an article from a journal called the Occidental Quarterly. I've got a picture there of its most recent issue, just so you can see how much they're styling themselves to look like a academic journal. But this review that I'm quoting from here was actually in the very first issue of the Occidental Quarterly, way back in 2001. Incidentally, that very first issue, the inaugural issue, included Enoch Powell's Rivers of Blood speech in what they called their Classics Corner. And it also had a long article analyzing Powell's legacy. Powell, of course, is the editor of the OCT Thucydides and a prominent classical scholar who's probably better known for giving a famous xenophobic cite, which is still often quoted on the giving a xenophobic speech in the 60s, I believe, that's still often quoted on the sites I work on. In any case, here they're reviewing this book, The Trouble with Democracy, by this man, William Gardner, who's a Canadian nationalist, white nationalist. He's also an Olympic track star. And he makes the same point that in the ancient world, we would consider the narrow franchise or exclusive franchise there undemocratic. And he makes the further point that in the United States, and he claims in Canada, I'm not as familiar with that history, the franchise started out narrowly defined, drawing on ancient models, he claims, to sort of say that the expansion of the franchise and the extension of the franchise in the history of this nation has actually been bad for this nation. It's a way we've lost the Hellenic virtues, they might say, that we used to have in a time of closer imitation of the ancient models. Now, it's not just the exclusions of ancient democracy, so-called, that they like. It's the whole concept of the polis as a unified participatory entity. And one of the very influential proponents of this idea is a French intellectual named Alain de Benoit. He's been promoting white ethno-nationalism since the 60s, and he's really one of the pioneers of European nationalism after World War II, a time when the people involved in nationalism were trying to distance themselves from violence and totalitarianism that we saw in the fascist regimes. And the approach to that was through a critique of modern institutions and values, and especially America's influence in Europe. And he's really, de Beaunois is one of the people who's been at the forefront of the development of many of the euphemisms for racism and xenophobia that are used by white supremacists today, especially his idea of ethno-pluralism, which masquerades as a tolerant idea, saying that no races are superior to other races. But in fact, everyone is happier if the races are kept separate and have their own homelands. It's basically a pure ethno-nationalist idea, a segregationist idea that he and people associated with him have been working on for many decades now. And Richard was quite right to say that I think my work on rhetoric before it doesn't have to lead to this, but there is a similarity, because there's I got very interested in the way that people in antiquity made arguments, and it's not a long jump to the way people make arguments about antiquity. But de Beaunois is also one of the first people developing what they explicitly call a metapolitical strategy for white nationalism, which is an idea, it's actually taken from far left politics. The idea is that before ideas become politically viable, they need to be culturally respectable and culturally acceptable. And so you lay the groundwork for a political revolution, that is for winning elections or whatever your ultimate political goal is, with a cultural program of making your ideas respectable. And I think this underpins their interest in Greco-Roman antiquity, a time of history which is widely respected, widely admired, widely regarded as worth taking seriously, and also that happens in its social practices to align with a lot of white supremacist ideas. And so it's a perfect rhetorical device for them to use in this project of trying to make their ideas acceptable. Back to a little bit about Alain de Beaunois, he conforms to the profile of intellectual white nationalism that I've been describing. Supposedly he has the largest private library in France. He's a member of the high IQ society Mensa. And at certain times he's been an important intellectual in France. He won a prestigious award from the Académie Française for essay writing. It's actually the same award that Paul Vane, the classical scholar, has won. And for 15 years, he wrote for the weekly magazine of Le Figaro in France. And you can tell how important Greco-Roman antiquity is to him and his movement by the acronym of their think tank, GRES, which sort of invokes antiquity as a source of European civilization, as they put it. And in fact, the successor organization to GRES is called the Iliad Institute. So it's the movement very, very explicitly engages with Greco-Roman antiquity. Anyway, in a 1985 book by de Beaunois, which was translated into English in 2011 by Arctos Media, that of course is a time when sort of what we think of as the current instantiation of highbrow white supremacy in this country was taking shape in 2011. Anyway, he wrote that the difference between ancient and modern democracy is that ancient democracy defines citizens by origins, whereas the modern one doesn't define them, but just sort of celebrates what he calls the atomized individual, or down below he calls the exaltation of the rootless individual, this idea of the ancient world as a time when citizenship was defined by something cohesive, and they would say, using the anachronism of race, they would say racially cohesive, in contrast to the modern, more cosmopolitan, world-spanning state that he regards as hopelessly fragmented and dominated by individual self-interest instead of this kind of collective identity. And you might detect a whiff of anti-Semitism in that phrase, the rootless individual, because there's of course an anti-Semitic canard that one of the reasons Jewish people are a threat to white civilization, so-called, is because of their rootlessness. That's a phrase. That and the atomized individual are two phrases that appear all the time on these sites I work on. So they understand the value of ancient democratic institutions as represented by Athens as the way that they would see the polis as rejecting a citizenship or the values of individualism that they claim are so detrimental to the contemporary world. So they're often citing in their essays about the ancient polis, not just Athens specifically, but this idea that there was no notion of individual liberty in antiquity. And they're very interested also in the kind of ritual and cultic practices of the ancient polis, the way they claim the state religion was an ancestor cult, a patriarchal and exclusionary ancestor cult that made reproduction a sacred duty. Both of these things align with a racialized theory of the polis, because they see the worship as ancestors and the duty to reproduce as kind of recognizing both the value of and the need to continue a kind of genetic identity, which of course they believe a racial identity is a genetic identity. The need to continue those was recognized by the institutions of the polis, and they often quote this 19th century French historian Fustel de Coulanges about this, and there they have a quote from his work about, again, the sort of recognition of what they would say are ties of blood in the ancient definition of citizenship. And you know, they're very explicit in these ties of blood being the defining feature, they claim, of ancient citizenship as a superior way of defining citizenship to what we have now. And that leads them to say that the ancient city-states should be considered the first ethno-states, which of course are what these organizations are trying to bring about in the modern world. And in that second quote I have here, it's just one place where they reveal that this kind of idea about the ancient polis as being a successful and viable ethno-state is important in the landscape of white ethno-nationalist thought, which assumes, and it indeed argues, excuse me, that white people, so-called, are facing an existential threat in the modern world, whether from immigration or falling birth rates among white populations, driven by, they would say, hostile governments that possibly dominated by Jewish interests, they would claim, are seeking the extermination of the white race. You know, they see the polis as the kind of social structure you need to survive in a hostile world. And so that they look at this as a kind of model for how white people should be banding together to survive in a world that they regard as hopelessly anti-white. And they love, for example, to quote the battle cry from Aeschylus's Persians, which they see as, it appears on several of their sites, they see that as a statement that showed that the ancient Greeks understood, for example, that the Persian Wars, they believe, was not just a fight for political freedom, but actually the fight for the survival of what the white ethno-nationalists would define as a racial identity, the references to the children and the fatherland and the gods and the ancestors shows, again, that just as the polis is defined, they believed, by a genetic relationship, that Greece itself recognized, had a sort, they would say, a racial consciousness of its, you know, genetic purity against this Persian invasion. Now, these are things they say about the Athens in general, or the polis in general, but they're very interested in Athens specifically. You know, they really like that it wasn't a democracy in the sense that we mean it, in that it was exclusive. And one way they approach this is to find what they call ethnopolitical content in the history of that democracy. So they look at Solon, and they praise Solon for having reforms which were you know, in some ways democratic, but also undemocratic from a modern point of view. And in fact, there's an article, I haven't linked to it here, but who writes that, who by a very prominent member of this community I'm writing about, saying that Solon's debt forgiveness is a policy that white ethno-nationalists should pursue as a way, he thinks, of shattering the power of, he would say, the Jewish-dominated banking system to which we're all enslaved. So Solon's debt, the shaking off of burdens, as a model for white ethno-nationalist revolution against the you know, elite Jewish banking conspiracy, he claims. Cleisthenes, they interpret his replacement of the 4 tribes based on family relationships with 10 tribes based on geography. They interpret that as a way to sort of strengthen the polis identity over these family identities. And this is a pretty tendentious understanding of Cleisthenes' motives, but it actually doesn't seem like Cleisthenes was such a democratic saint either. I think the analysis of his reforms that I'm familiar with identifies the new tribes as a kind of gerrymandered system that gave advantages to Cleisthenes' family and his allies in the new system over the previous system. And they even quote Susan Leip's book, to say that the Athenian democracy was based on an early notion of racial citizenship, which is Susan Leip's phrase. Now, I think this is a misrepresentation of what Leip says in her book. What they're claiming is that Leip says that the Athenians understood that citizenship was racially based. I think what Leip is really arguing is that in periods when the institutions of Athens were under political stress, or when there was political instability in Athens, that's when racial language around citizenship becomes more frequent in Athens. So Leip, I think, is showing that racial discourses like that are always ideologically driven and not grounded in essential nature. But in any case, she does show very convincingly that those discourses existed in Athens, I would say, and they certainly pick up on that as congenial to their analysis of the polis. There's another article I haven't linked here even that goes so far as to say what we should have in the United States is sortition. We should have random selection of our political leaders, because that would serve white interests better than an election system in a time when the government is anti-white, the media who controls who's able to become popular enough to be elected is anti-white, and so on. So, all their paranoia about the anti-white regime that they claim dominates the world sort of feeds into an analysis of the advantages of these ancient political structures. They really admire Pericles. In particular, we talk about Solon and Cleisthenes, but Pericles is their favorite for his citizenship reforms there. But they also like the funeral oration, because they believe that the funeral oration, they recognize it as propaganda, but they like the propaganda. It's ethnopolitical propaganda, they believe. The honor to the ancestors, praising the mothers who have children, saying that childless people are less fit for citizenship. They find a lot of inspiration in Pericles. And of course, to just mention the Persian Wars, which we mentioned before, they're very fond of quoting Herodotus, that the Athenians, the military strength of the Athenians was because of their freedom. Here we have a review of the landmark Herodotus, a book some of us may use in our classes on this white ethno-nationalist site, Countercurrents, where they quote the passage from Herodotus in that translation. At the bottom, we have them talking about the traitorous leadership of the contemporary world, abandoning white people to a barbarism worse than Persians. In any case, they see Herodotus's analysis of the Persian Wars as a kind of ratification of the strength of the polis, of the strength of a genetically defined citizen body, xenophobic citizenship policies, investment in the kind of purity of the citizenship in the citizen body. They see Herodotus as ratifying the strength of that social structure against foreign invasion, which is of course what they think we're undergoing in the contemporary world as well. And just a couple other notes about the Persian Wars. They like when Herodotus says that the Greeks' rallying cry at Thermopylae and Artemisium was to stop the foreigners entering from Greece. The word there is barbaroi that they're translating there. And they like the passage in Plato's Laws where one of the speakers says that if not for the Athenians and Spartans, we would have a virtually complete mixture of the races, Greek with barbarian, etc. That word being translated there is genos, gene in the text. And of course, genos is a word that does and does not line up with the modern anachronistic concept of race. But I think the point I would make here is they're just using the Hackett translation. I didn't actually look to see who the translator was. It doesn't really matter. But this is a widely available mainstream translation, which presents that argument in a way that's very congenial to white ethno-nationalist thought. So, I think the first point I want to make today is that there's a surprising amount, they find a surprising, to me at least when I started working on this, amount of overlap with their beliefs and things they can find in the ancient world. And to us, I think that's surprising because we think of these groups as being a threat to democracy, but in their view, Athens supports their worldview very well. And the second point I want to make, though, is that I think it's important to realize that these ideas that they're promulgating about Athens are not, in some respects, extremist ideas. They're not in all ways fringy ideas. What's really valuable, I think, about these appropriations is how they should, I believe, prompt us to reflect on some of the uncomfortable familiarity of these ideas in modern thought. and indeed in the history of classics. And so in the last part of my talk, I want to talk a little bit about the intellectual history of these ideas. This is research I'm really just starting, so I'm grateful for the opportunity to share it with you. And I'm sure there's a lot of people here with significant expertise in intellectual history, so I really welcome any comments on this in the Q&A later. At this point, I'm really just relying on other people's accounts of this intellectual history. And the goal in bringing up this history is not to say that this or that person from history is a white ethno-nationalist in the way that people writing on these sites are, but to show that many aspects of these ideas have a very distinguished intellectual history, and indeed a mainstream intellectual history, as a way of resisting the idea that we're talking about extremists here. I think what's extreme about the sites is the explicitness with which they racialize these discourses. But a lot of their ideas, as I'll say, are grounded in pretty mainstream thought. So actually, before we get to that slide, I'll just say we can start by saying that in many respects, the things they say about the ancient city-states do not misrepresent it. The exclusions of Athenian democracy are well documented. We haven't even mentioned enslavement. One example is the way they praise Solon on these sites. You know, when you read about ancient democracy in the scholarship, a lot of times I think scholars consider Cleisthenes the founder of the Athenian democracy because Solon's reforms were not that democratic. But actually the Athenians regarded Solon as the founder of their democracy, and the white ethno-nationalists do too. And so I sometimes actually feel like the white ethno-nationalists sort of get Athens or see Athens a little more clearly than at least the traditional view of Athens. The exclusions and the violence of the Athenian system have not always been at the forefront of our thinking about ancient Athens. And so on this slide, I have various examples of people who have idealized, I think, Athens throughout history. Many of you will be familiar with them, maybe even more familiar than I am. But you know, George Grote, of course, wrote a famous history, an influential history of Greece that you know, was reacting against anti-democratic thought in Britain, in his country. But in making his argument about Athens, he ignored enslavement more or less. He ignored the violence of the Athenian Empire. Next to him, I have John Stuart Mill, who was, of course, a abolitionist in his life, in some ways kind of a hardcore abolitionist, but he also believed that the Greeks invented political liberty, and he did not seem to really think that their practice of enslavement compromised their status as the inventors of political liberty. And in fact, that contradiction led him to engage in apologetics for ancient enslavement, basically arguing that because ancient slavery was not based on racial criteria as it was in his day, that somehow did not complicate the idea of Greece as a place of political liberty. Moving on to the continent, Ernest Renan, he's a person who did a lot to popularize this idea of the Greek miracle for the efflorescence of culture and political ideas in Athens. But he was also an apologist for the French imperial project as a civilizing project. And then in the 20th century, Karl Popper, of course, wrote a very influential book, The Open Society and Its Enemies, basically arguing that Platonic thought lay behind the fascist regimes of the 20th century. But because Plato was such a critic of Athens, Popper's book, very critical of Plato, was in some sense an idealization of Athens. And he even argued apparently that there was an abolitionist movement in Athens, something that Wilfred Nippo in his history of ideas about democracy that I'm relying on a lot here, he calls that nothing more than a benevolent fantasy. Now, most of you will know that for most of intellectual history, Athens was considered a negative model as proof that democracy was a bad idea or was nothing more than mob rule, and it was often used to oppose democratic reforms and the extension of the franchise Athens was. But even so, Pericles was admired as a kind of strongman leader who could save democracy from itself. And this is basically the ideology, I think, behind the authoritarian candidates we're seeing in Europe and, of course, in our own country. up there I have a quote from Curtius about how every popular mass has to be ruled, and his example was Pericles' combination of popular and autocratic rule. A little before him, Wilhelm Schmidt said that Pericles and the Attic state were to a certain extent grown into one, that Pericles was a true king who blended into the state and held its destiny in its hands. And then down there at the right, I have Helmut Berv, who of course is a card-carrying member of the Nazi Party and an important Nazi scholar. But he praised Pericles too for his demonic strength of leadership that, as Berv said, activated all the strata of Athenian people, molding them together into a genuine living community within the state. So there's a kind of continuity between these older ideas and what we find under the Nazi regime. And I actually just recently learned that apparently in World War I, there were quotes from Pericles' funeral oration on the sides of buses in London. And Gilbert Murray, the classical scholar, later gave a speech in which he said that those signs were there to remind us of the ideals which we had to defend in the war. So there's another idealization of Pericles too. Thinking a little bit about Alain de Benoit's idea that the ancient democracy was a place where the citizen body was a cohesive whole, unlike the modern atomized so-called democracy, he would put it. That idea that the ancient world represents a kind of wholeness and the modern world a kind of fragmentation is a very common idea throughout intellectual history. Just one early example is Herder, who I have there, who the idea of modernity as a fragmented time and antiquity as a strong period that needs to be sort of resurrected to save modernity from its fragmentation. And similarly, this view of Athens as a time when things were better than they are now. I've put Macaulay here, who wrote a lot about antiquity. He wrote that there seems to be every reason to believe that in general intelligence, the Athenian populace far surpassed the lower orders of any community that has ever existed. So this idea that Athenians were the smartest people in history. And Grote apparently even made that more pointed and said, actually, the Athenians were more intelligent than British voters in his own time. But I put that up there because I put that up there with Francis Galton because Galton is the one who said that the Athenians had the highest IQ in history. And he also said that the indigenous people of Australia had the lowest IQ in history. And, an idea which is used to justify exploitation and domination and indeed extermination of people. And Galton is, deeply implicated in the history of eugenics and race pseudoscience, and this idealized vision of ancient Athens in comparison to modernity is sort of part of how he builds his case. Moving to the United States, have some examples of prominent people who viewed Athens as in somehow being better than the modern world. We've got Robert Hutchins, the president of the University of Chicago and the founder of their Great Books program. He said that the society in which Plato lived did not need to hear the conversations of Socrates as much as we do. Our world is more degenerated somehow than the ancient world, more in need of truth even than the ancient world was. Richard Weaver, he was very interested in truth. He was an anti-relativist. He thought in Athens truth was respected and people were strong, unlike the relativist and weak modernity. Peter Viereck, a Harvard man, wrote that the Athenian classics train the complete man rather than the fragmentary man. Again, this idea of the modern democracy being a time of fragmentation and atomization that could be solved by a return to an Athenian model. And then Alan Bloom, of course, who basically insisted that the Athenians thought virtue was more important than freedom, and in the present is just the opposite. And these are of course, prominent scholars at prominent members of the faculty at American colleges and universities who made these arguments. This idea about ancient freedom too. There's this famous dichotomy between ancient liberty as the freedom to participate in politics versus modern liberty as just the individual freedom from state interference. And this is this is a claim found throughout the white ethno-nationalist sites. And it's actually a claim that has always been made in the context of saying that the modern world is somehow declined from the ancient world. It's mainly associated with Benjamin Constant, but it's also articulated earlier by Thomas Hobbes. And again, a key figure in the history of this is Fustel de Coulanges, who is cited, as I said, by many of these sites. His interest was in religion, not in liberty per se, but he did, as I understand it, make the argument that in antiquity there was no religious liberty. You didn't choose whether to adhere to the state religion or not. You didn't choose whether to believe or not. It was sort of, as I think he put it, the state religion had empire over the members of the state. And he, of course, is a figure that's been used by racists for a long time. In 1909, for example, there was a book written in France that praised Athenian democracy as a model. And that book was attacked by the anti-Semitic group Action Française, who used Fustel de Coulanges to challenge the claims of that book. And in fact, they said that Athens' toleration of medics, of foreigners, was parallel to France's toleration of Jews in their society. And Fustel de Coulanges has actually been reprinted by a racist press with a name, a title that tries to bring out what they believe are the racial elements of his arguments. This is not by Arctos Media, it's by a different racist press. Now, it seems like Fustel de Coulanges didn't share these views. I'm trying to get my hands on a dissertation on this topic, but he did emphasize the religious and cultural structures of the city. And so insofar as his analysis of that was correct, I think some elements of his thought do support them. And then, of course, there's the invocation of the Persian Wars as a vindication for this model of a citizen soldier and citizen participation in war. That's, of course, a very old idea that Edith Hall has argued begins in the classical period, right, with the xenophobic plays like Aeschylus's Persians that the sites love to quote. I've got a quote from John Stuart Mill there about the Battle of Marathon being more important than the Battle of Hastings. I've been reading a lot of Johanna Hanink's book on the sort of Athenian propaganda and its legacy in European intellectual history. The Greek War of Independence, British and French interest in the Greek War of Independence was conditioned by this idea of a replaying of the Persian Wars. There's Byron apparently said we need more Spartans in Greece to liberate the country, which is actually exactly the same claim that a prominent Austrian white nationalist made a year ago when Turkey opened its borders with Greece to in a sort of geopolitical conflict with Greece. And this Austrian man, summoned white nationalists to the Greek border to defend Europe from the foreign invaders. And Hanink also talks about at the Acropolis, there used to be this light show. I guess it started in 1959 and it ran for something like 4 decades. Hanink cites Elizabeth Marlowe's work on this, the art historian's work on this. Apparently the light show began with a voiceover that said, "Tonight on this hill, we will revive the golden age of Athens." And according to Marlowe, the Persians in this were represented as cardboard cutout bad guys. The voiceover called them reckless, bloodthirsty, and barbaric, while the Athenians are described as courageous, noble, as heroic. And the voiceover also included quotes from the funeral oration. And I also have Barry Strauss's book here about the Salamis that saved Western civilization. Hanink cites this as an example of recent work, which still uses this idea of the Persian Wars as a sort of civilizational conflict. And there's also a kind of an idea that's become popular in the 20th century that democratic states fare better in war than other kinds of states or than armies under tyranny. And one statement of that is this book, Democracy of War, which I think came out in 2002. And it actually quotes the same passage from Herodotus that the white ethno-nationalists quote. And then they go on to say that Pericles makes a similar point in praise of Athenian democracy in his funeral oration during the Peloponnesian War. Again, showing Pericles is the one person who understood how to make a democracy strong. Now these 2 books I have here don't make their claims in any kind of explicitly racial terms, but you do wonder, considering the kind of coded language of Western civilization, whether a racialized claim sort of lurks in the background of this way of thinking about that conflict. So, none of these people, except for Helmut Berv, I guess, none of these people thought of themselves as being explicitly engaged in a white supremacist project. But I think we should think about where they're located in history. A lot of them are Enlightenment thinkers, which was, of course, a time of contradiction where, the intellectual culture is espousing human rights and democratic revolution, while at the same time expanding their empires and strengthening the colonial domination of their imperial possessions. So it's not really just a matter, it seems to me, of these ideas being taken in perverse directions by the white ethno-nationalists, but more of those dimensions already being present in the milieu that produced these ideas, the colonialist milieu that produced these ideas, and that drove in some ways the invocation of Athens. That direction has always been at least a possible dimension of these ideas. And so for my poster, I chose von Klenz's idealized view of the Acropolis. As working as the architect for Prince Otto in Greece, von Klenz's idealized idea of antiquity had real effects. He was in charge of preserving and quote unquote restoring the Acropolis, and any kind of restoration, of course, that's continuing into the present day. That's an act of idealization and erasure. And I think there's something kind of similar going on in any kind of engagement with the ancient world that tries to bring it to bear on the present in a political way. We may look at the white supremacists and say they present a perverse version of the past, but they have significant intellectual forebears going right back to the xenophobic discourses of the Greeks themselves. And the whole history is one of distortion and exclusion and to some degree of idealization in the name of making Athens a kind of model or anti-model. And I think that process is really at the heart of classicism. And so the white supremacists show us the dangers of that process in which we are still engaged. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Curtis. That was a marvelous presentation, and yes, sort of reminding, I think, particularly valuable the reminder that, or the demonstration that that we're not dealing with simply the ignorant and simply the January 6th helmeted types getting their classics from the 300 and from the sort of the but rather from the essence of not just our discipline, but of intellectual thought of the recent centuries. And of course, one question is what we do with that. Sort of, we as historians of scholarship, we do exactly what you have done. And I think Cornel West's letter to the provost and others at Howard, his expansion of the canon, of course, to the provost of an institution where Toni Morrison was a classics major.
Minor, I think, but
minor. Okay, yeah, but shows exactly, the ways of neither denying or discarding, but engaging and inquiring and suggesting sort of ways forward that that I think your work is very valuable with. So I'm going to open up the floor now, and I guess Allison may keep an eye on the chat, but again, please raise your Zoom hand, since there are a couple of screens, so I may not see you if you just raise your own hand. But so yeah, the floor is open for questions or observations. Greg is saying hi to Curtis. So
yeah, hi Greg. It's nice to see you here today. He was I was a student of his when he was the SEDA professor.
Oh right, okay.
A lot of friends here from the past. You honor me by coming.
Yeah, so happy to see you, Curtis.
Yeah, thank you, Greg. Thanks for being here today.
So does since Greg has publicly greeted you. Maybe does the Homeric, the presence of the Homeric poems in Athens get sort of folded into any of this, either Greg or Curtis, maybe, since they are so much a part of the Athenian and Pan-Athenaic.
You know, they're very interested in Homer, but I wouldn't say that they see Homer as a kind of encoding of sort of the warrior ethos that they believe white people need to cultivate in the modern world to survive, and that's been, destroyed by modernity. Then they see Odysseus as a kind of like paradigmatic, quote unquote, white hero, a person who survives in a hostile world against violent foreigners who are trying to destroy him, and then who, returns, they claim, to his homeland, and through violence cleanses his homeland to regain his, rightful place of power. So they really like Odysseus, they really like Diomedes, they like Achilles, maybe to some extent. So they like the Homeric epics a lot. I haven't seen them talk about that's actually an interesting point, Richard. Sometimes you feel like if they knew a little more, they actually would have an even stronger argument. That the sort of veneration of maybe that's too strong a word, Greg, you can correct me, but the sort of high status accorded to the Homeric epics in Athens, they could cite that, if they knew about it, as a example of the sort of celebration of the warrior ethos in Athens. And I actually do wonder, when we think about the glorification of the citizen soldier, which are discourses that exist in antiquity, if there's a kind of, if that gives some explanation, adds explanation to the popularity of the Homeric epics in a polis context that seems to have idealized this idea of the citizen soldier.
Richard, may I?
Yeah,
may I
go ahead,
speak to that?
please, Greg, please.
One thing that fascinates me is that when you look at the metopes on the Parthenon, there's a lot of compassion for the Trojans, which kind of messes things up for people who want to politicize Homeric poetry, because Athenian reception really doesn't take sides whether the Achaeans or the Trojans are the good guys. And in fact, I'm thinking of that speech by Lycurgus, Curtis, towards the end of the 4th century, where it seems that the most admirable person in the Iliad is Hector, not Achilles.
Mm-hmm.
So it's almost like a Virgilian view, so to speak, of Homeric poetry, Richard, which I think you will welcome.
Yeah, and I think, and Virgil may have seen the Parthenon, that the jury's still out, but he has, he has a peplos in the middle of Dido's temple in Carthage, which again has their empathy for the Trojan/Romans. So that I think that's a natural Virgilian phenomenon, but it's one that he could also have picked up from observation. And I do get the sense that Virgil is more useful to the white ethno-nationalists, and partly because Pershel, whom I talked about, talks of Aeneas on the side of Rome being cleansed of his Trojanness and becoming an Occidental, which is just amazing, amazing material. And that Rome and the crushing of Carthage is used as such an easy metaphor for the anti-Semitism of that particular project. But I've wondered about how the Homeric project plays in that. I guess it's just a warrior culture, which though is that really in the Homeric writings, is that the soldier farmer that that gets so racialized by the Nazis in the Roman context, Cato in particular, Cato's De Agricultura, which celebrates that.
Well, in a way, Richard, the lucky thing for Homer is that the Pisistratids, the way they managed the Homeric tradition in the 6th century, uh, they were so different from, shall we say, the later reception that it's almost impossible to politicize Homer as a right winger.
Uh-huh. Yeah. That's a great point.
On that point of the kind of let me check my note here. What did you say? The compassion for the Trojans. I don't find that exactly on the sites, but they don't actually play it up as, they don't consider the Iliad as the victory of the white European Greeks over the decadent Easterner. They don't read it that much that way. They do talk about the luxury of Troy, and they talk about it as decadent, but they act, there's this one article, there's this one essay I've read about it, which actually takes a kind of familiar view of both sides as sort of having tragic qualities. That the Troy, they would say, is a great civilization that has gone into decline, and the Greek side is a sort of barbaric civilization that's trying to become a civilization. They sort of see the poem in that way, and there's a kind of version of compassion for Troy in that. Like the conflict isn't so much racialized in that analysis as a, sort of two civilization, as a warning about civilizations at different stages of their development. They have this whole Spenglerian idea of like the rises and falls of civilization that they kind of map onto the Homeric epics also. Yeah, Richard, I think historically Virgil's been very useful for people like the Nazis, but I don't find Virgil as much on the contemporary sites, because I really think.
Yeah,
I think your talk, you did mention the thing I wrote about the guy who talked about Virgil, but he had a very poor understanding of Virgil compared to, say, the people that I'm talking about
right.
in this today. Right. I think this is where you start to see the rhetorical dimension. There, I mentioned Identity Europa. Before that group dissolved, one reason that group dissolved was because a hacker group got a hold of their internal chats on Discord, which is the app they were using. And I've gone through those chats. I haven't written anything about it, but at one point in those chats, one person in this white supremacist group says, "Shouldn't we be talking about Germanic mythology? Like, isn't Germanic mythology closer to what we're trying to bring about?" And the leader of the group says, "Yes, actually, Germanic mythology would be better for us, but it's not as widely respected as classical mythology. So we have to use classical mythology." And I think I see the the Virgil as sort of being losing out a little in that, because they're not only concerned with how well it fits with their ideology, but also with how well known it is. Again, remember, the project is to make their ideas respectable. And so if Virgil isn't as well known, we could debate what's more well known or not, but I think they may feel that Virgil's not as well known as assumed to be well known as the Greek material that they work a lot more with. They write a lot about Rome and they write a lot about Carthage. You're right about that, but in terms of writing specifically about Virgil, there's not that much about analyzing the Virgilian poems.
And that may be a romanticism too, that goes. Now the Germanic over the classical, you see that anxiety in a number of German classicists, trying to make the classics sort of as Nordic or compete with the Nordic stuff, which, Hitler wasn't so interested in the classical material, but I'm getting out of my territory. So Adrian, you had a question on that. Then I'd like to get us back to Hutchins, Robert Hutchins, and the great, and I think what goes to the core of what some of us are thinking about now. How do we keep the great books, but just call them great books, and not the only great books? But how do we keep them, along with subtracting the ideological and exclusive uses to which they've been put? And again, I think West in opening the canon up is, he's not the only one, but in the immediate context of immediate discussions, that seems to be, but is that cynical just to throw in a few extra things and still call them great books while thinking of them as great books plus? So how do we push back against the, maybe unintended, maybe unrealized, maybe realized racial aspects of things like the Great Books projects at Chicago and Columbia, while still saying that this stuff matters. I mean, that we haven't wasted the last 20, 30, 40, 50, 60 years, depending on how old each of us is on this material. But that's maybe a separate question from the one that Adrian has. So Adrian, why don't you come on in?
Yes, thank you, Rick. And above all, thank you, Curtis, for this wonderful talk. I have a question which you cannot answer, I'm not sure. You have looked at the reception part, the genealogy of how these patterns, how they evolved and how they are abused now in these journals and other media they use in the internet. Do you have any idea, are there any possibilities actually to follow these guys, how they disseminate their opinions? Do you follow blogs, for example, or do you follow chats, just to see whether they have any impact at all, whether they have kind of discussions about that? Can you say something about that, or is it basically impossible to see what they do and how they disseminate actually their messages?
Yeah, this is a good question, and you're right that answering it requires a different kind of expertise than a classical scholar has, because it's more of a kind of like media studies skill. But I'll say I do have a couple things to say about it. One is that some of the sites I work on report on their page views. Now they'll say this is how many people visited our website this month. Now they might be making it up, but a lot of people visit these websites if they are not making it up. At the beginning, I was bragging about 320,000 views since I launched the site 4 years ago. They get 320,000 views in a month, according to their numbers. So a lot of people go to these sites, if that's true. And in fact, there's a book. I might have it in my pile here, but anyway, there's a book. It came out a couple years ago by this guy Thomas Main at the Brookings Institution about. He used the terminology of the alt-right, which is kind of just a euphemism for, rebranded white supremacy. But I think his book is called The Rise of the Alt-Right or something like that. But he has a whole chapter in which he's used external sources to analyze the traffic going to these sites. And this is a few years ago. And he found that many of these sites have as large or bigger followings than what we would consider mainstream news outlets. So they reach a lot. If you really wanted to follow them, all of them are active on social media, but the kind of fringy social media, things like Telegram and Gab. Jim O'Hara put the book in the chat. Thank you, Jim. Telegram and Gab and this site called Minds. You would need to delve into these worlds. That these are platforms that market themselves as sort of censorship-free or free speech platforms, but they really have become like cesspools of hate speech in many respects. They promote their ideas there. If you wanted to get really serious, you could go into places like 4chan to see examples of where where these ideas come from. The other way to think about their impact, though, is in the context of this. There's a movement in this country around what's called dangerous speech, which is something I'm not an expert on, but it's the idea that it's developing a theory of describing speech which can be expected to lead to violent action, and it's part of a sort of a legal movement trying to, in a sense, differentiate dangerous speech from free speech, I think, as a way of saying that free speech rights should not apply to dangerous speech. But it's very difficult to say that this essay caused this act of violence. But if you take, for example, the mass murderer in Christchurch, New Zealand a few years ago, his manifesto was called The Great Replacement. And that is the name of a book written by a French intellectual, which used as its sort of center in the French edition, at least. Actually, in the American version, the reference to antiquity was shunted off to like page 112. But in the French edition, Greco-Roman antiquity, and in particular Plato's Cratylus, is the sort of driving text for analyzing Frenchness as this idea that, as Frenchness is a thing which is essential and unchanging and transhistorical, and that a person from outside can never achieve. He used, this writer Camus used Plato's Cratylus to try to define Frenchness that way. And so this book, this very high intellectual book, has become one of the ways that this idea of a conspiracy theory to replace white people with non-white people is spread, and this mass murderer in New Zealand was aware of this work. And I really need to get organized and write a post on my site about all the examples I've collected where real world violence can be connected with Greco-Roman antiquity, because I don't think classics is like centrally key to the violent actions taken by people, but it's part of the intellectual landscape that informs these violent acts. And the Christchurch shooting is in a sense just the most high profile example of that.
Great. Thank you, Curtis. So we have a couple of questions, and if you could, I know who each of our first two questioners are, but if you could just identify yourself. So Supratik, I think you were first.
Sure. Thanks very much. So I'm Supratik Barale. I'm a fifth-year PhD student at Harvard in the ancient history track, broadly working on sort of connections between the Middle East and the Mediterranean and formations of empire. First, thank you very much for the talk. I mean, I think it was really interesting in sort of spelling out the xenophobic discourse that's kind of inherent in so-called classical Athens, and how that's kind of taken on in more sophisticated ways than we assume by white nationalists and academics alike, and it's sort of part of the mainstream discourse. The question I had was this. The question I had was from here. What so how do we reach a wider audience, especially a non-specialist audience,
Supratik,
and get them to think.
Supratik, could I just interrupt, because you lost us at a dramatically crucial moment, or at least lost me, when you said the question is.
Okay.
Then your audio dropped out.
Is it better?
Yeah, it's better, and probably if you just stay fairly still, or don't turn your video off, that might help. But just try giving us what the essence of your the wonderful lead in, and
yeah, there's a very good lead in.
To have the dramatic moment again. So the question is, so what is from all of what we've got now, what is the call to action here? How do we as specialists reach a wider non-specialist audience than the white nationalists and the erudite white nationalists do? And I'm thinking not just of sort of reaching an audience of white nationalists or people like that, but I'm thinking especially of apathetic liberals, for example, and getting them to connect the uses and misuses of this material to things like collective action and activism. So how does that step work, in your opinion?
Yeah, that's a great question, and in a sense, it's the question, right? So I appreciate it very much. So I definitely think there's a role for scholars to share their expertise as broadly as possible. I think my site is an attempt at that. I've been sort of successful at reaching a broad audience, but you can reach much broader. The SCS blog actually reaches a bigger audience per post certainly than my site does. So I think there's a role for that, definitely, to spread that. I don't think we should underestimate our teaching either. I mean, that's a kind of maybe small audience in terms of number of people, but really being conscious about the ways we present the ancient world, how we assign value to the study of the ancient world, you know, that's a way of sort of bringing about, I think, a generational change. And in fact, you know, each student that becomes energized around this material then can go out and sort of be an ambassador. So there can be a kind of multiplier effect. So that's one reason I think it's really valuable to incorporate some of this material into our teaching as well. And I've just started to sort of try to provide some apparatus for doing that on my site. If you look at some of the recent posts, sometimes trying to provide a kind of way to balance sort of respect for student safety and also the value of this material in understanding kind of the stakes in the study of the ancient world. So that's part of it. But I actually think one thing, I want to admit that I was really naive when I started doing this work. I think maybe as only a white person could be. Like, I think I thought that my job was to learn about what they were saying and provide refutations of it that people could use. And over time, I sort of realized that those refutations, you know, you're dealing with pretty low level stuff if all you're going to do is refute. That actually what's at the heart of their use of antiquity is actually, I think, a fundamental congruence between some of their ideas and what we find in the ancient world. And that the problem is this idealization or this uncritical idealization of the ancient world. And that's a much harder thing to grapple with than say refuting a historical fact here or there. And so that's where it starts to intersect with a kind of with an act of self-reflection that I think we as classical scholars need to undergo. And that's going to look different for different people, right? So my self-reflection, not to make too many assumptions, but my self-reflection is going to be a lot different than yours, right? In terms of my acculturation as a classical scholar, my, you know, why I got into this business and so on. Like, I think I'm going to notice a lot more familiarity between things that I either was taught to believe or figured out on my own than you will. But you know, what I'm trying to do in my work now is sort of provide a call to people to do that work of self-reflection, the self work, which I think is sort of fundamental to, you know, then the cultural change that we're trying to make. It's going to be hard to do that change until we've all sort of owned up to our own investments in some of these ideas, to the extent that we have those investments. I know that I have found that I have many. Because the change of the broader perceptions is going to be more difficult than we think. Again, the change of broader perceptions of Greco-Roman antiquity is not going to be as simple as saying, well, you thought this about antiquity, but now you need to think this. Because actually the dominant culture is one. I think this is something that's becoming more and more clear. The dominant culture is one which is invested in white supremacist ideas, at least in this country, because the dominant culture is a white supremacist culture. And so if the 300 is a popular movie, if the representation of Gladiator is popular, if idealization of Athens as a democratic paragon is a fixed idea, that's partly because those ideas are congruent or you know, acceptable in that dominant culture. And so there's always going to be a kind of like headwind against changing those views, because there's sort of that congruence gives them a sort of staying power. Now, I don't want to say it's impossible, but I think we need to sort of own up to that being what we're up against also in sharing our ideas.
Thank you both. And Supratik, that was a fantastic question, and Curtis, some really good nuanced responses. Just on the teaching front, I want to just concur with that. I've been teaching the Metamorphoses. I finished today, just, you know, it's 18 undergrads and 3 graduate students, and just having, is Jackie Murray still here? Having heard Jackie speak about transhistoricism, which, you know, another word for that might be deliberate anachronism. So accepting that generally, I know some would differ, generally skin color racism is not something we find every day in our ancient texts, but we can assume that power imbalances can be transhistoricized to be thinking about that issue. And I found that Ovid, you know, a poem about power imbalance, sort of rape, violence, pursuit, and so on, is a very interesting text to think deliberately about. Not every sequence, but I found that sort of worked, I think, pretty well. And Miriam Camel, my wonderful TA here, did that work, Miriam? Just one small instance. I don't want to lose sight though of Supratik's fantastic question, and of that being the one thing that we can all control. We're all teachers. So Miriam, a word, and then we'll go to Suzanne.
Yeah, I think it worked really well. I was the TF for that class, which ended today. I think it was exactly what you, Curtis, were describing. Just sort of be aware as teachers the impact you have on this generation of students who may or may not go on with classics. And I think one thing, Richard, that you did this semester that I really liked was you were aware of current events, and you were aware of how the really fraught current events might be impacting our students, and you were sensitive to that. And we even had moments in our class periods we weren't really talking about Ovid at all. We were saying, we are advocates to the extent that we can be for minority populations, and we're here to listen to anything anyone has to say. So I appreciate that.
And that sounded like a setup. It wasn't supposed to be, but
yeah,
that's very, and anyway, and that sort of touches on the Hutchins question and the great books question. What are the ways in which they're great? I think the Aeneid is great to me in ways that it wasn't great to pretty much all but a very few in the 19th and early 20th century. But so that these texts are mobile, and their greatness doesn't reside in a single ideology. I don't think that's a cop-out to suggest that that's a way of reading them and still centering them in our curriculum. But Suzanne Lai.
Yeah. Hi, I'm Suzanne Lai, an assistant professor in classics at UNC Chapel Hill. Great to see some familiar faces, and thank you so much, Curtis, for this talk. So my question, I have a couple questions, and they kind of fit with sort of this great books idea, as well as the question about what do we do with this, information. And so, so I'm teaching a race and ethnicity in the ancient Mediterranean class right now. And one of the things that we've just been discussing a lot in class is just the change that happens over time about what gets emphasized, like where you turn the volume up and where you turn the volume down. And so, one of the surprising things, like with the early United States, Rome was really the model. And so Athens didn't really become the model until around the Jim Crow era, right? And around that. And so one of the things that the conversation in my class has been really going over is just this idea that we actually are choosing, or we can have choice as to what we curate, right? And so I guess part of my question, the two-part question is, so are the nationalists, and it seems like this is what you're saying, they're actually, there's just plenty of material for them to pull from, but they are really pulling, they're curating, like, are they curating or distorting, right? And it sounds like what you're saying in your talk is that they have so much to work with, they're actually just pulling it, and that's just part of our discipline. Would that be correct that you're saying that? And then if that's true, or like, is it a matter for a great books course, for example, that we recurate or expand and contextualize more? Because I wouldn't want to give up, Virgil or Homer. And, I found like great conversations with refugee populations about Virgil, who see a lot, so people can see a lot of themselves in that. So that's kind of the main question. Then I have a second one, but I'll let you go with that.
Yeah, thanks for being here today, Suzanne, and thanks for that question, and thanks for that language of curating versus distorting. Like I think that's a really useful distinction for this for what they're doing, because a lot of times people want to talk about what they're doing as abuse or misuse or distortion or sometimes lies or whatever you want to say, but like I said, I think that's not where the action is. But one way we can make, I think, progress with responding to them is in pointing out some of their methodological problems. And one of those, which I think is relevant to you, is that they take a very narrow view of what antiquity, what is included in antiquity. And the way this intersects with, so one response is to point out the narrowness of that view. That was something I was kind of trying to do around the Black Achilles thing a few years ago that, they don't, if you know about Memnon and the history of the study of Memnon and the different ways of interpreting Memnon, that actually is a pretty interesting way to think about this idea of casting a Black person to play Achilles in a lot of respects. But you can learn a lot if you bring Sophocles, Inachus had an African Zeus on stage. When you expand the view of what antiquity includes, you find all kinds of amazing things that make it less, more, I don't know, more interesting. So they've definitely curated an antiquity that supports their views. But that curation is very similar to the traditional curation in classical studies, right? The curation you find on these sites are basically the canonical texts and figures that have been considered canonical in the discipline for a long time. So I agree that a different curation would be helpful, but I think we also need to recognize that their curation is not an idiosyncratic one, but a pretty mainstream curation in the people they focus on.
Can I follow up on that just because
okay.
it's related to that, this idea. So if it is mainstream, my question is, where were these people before, right? Where were they going or were they always going to classics? Or like where, like this alt-right group, is it just social media that has brought them to the forefront and they were always there? I feel like they were always there, but where were they focusing their energies? Was it the medieval period? Was, where, they seem to be sort of, as I said, they're hopping from Rome to Athens, Sparta, they've been dabbling in medieval as well. And then, so that's one question. The other one is just, what is the emptiness that they're trying to fill? What is the inadequacy, by taking on this distorted perhaps form of masculinity and what is the essence that they're trying to pull to make their lives better? And I wonder if that might be an approach to rather than go point by point with them.
Okay. Yeah. So those are such great questions. Let me just say one thing about the great books question you asked first, and then I'll get to those other two ones. Because on this point of curation, you're talking about you don't want to lose Homer and Virgil. But then you brought up the refugee population interpretation of Virgil. Sorry to put it so boldly. To me, it feels like, if you or whatever, I think your idea of curating a different canon is a great one. And if you believe in your heart or whatever that Virgil and Homer should be in the canon, then there's still an act of curating, which is what are the sort of interpretations and responses to that you privilege. And so what you said about talking about refugee populations, understanding the Aeneid, seems like a really valuable way to teach Virgil in the course. And then this sort of comes back to Supertick's question a little bit, is what can we do? Is, in our work, we can make it easier for people to know what these other responses are, right? This is why the argument that reception studies needs to be kind of mainstreamed as a respected subdiscipline of classical studies, because if someone, say, could publish something and get credit for it on refugee populations' understanding of Aeneid, then that becomes something we can use in our teaching and we can use in our writing. That's the work of specialized historical scholarship can then serve that point of recurating. All right, then your question of what were they interested in before they were interested in classics? I'm not sure I'm totally competent to answer that question, but I'll tell you what at least I thought of, which is that I don't think actually the interest in classics is new with the alt-right of the social media age. I think there's certain things that were new with the alt-right, partly there, and by that I mean the kind of early 21st century online white ethno-nationalism. Their sophistication online, their recognition of the online space as a way to promote their ideas. Although Stormfront, one of the oldest neo-Nazi sites in the world, goes back to 1994. It's like one of the first sites on the internet, practically. Neo-Nazism was already there, and I haven't looked at their 1994 version, but they had the Parthenon as one of their logos. It's a very old-fashioned site. I doubt it's changed much over the years. So, Greco-Roman antiquity was already there. But, if you start looking into the I kind of feel like there's a gap in our understanding of the ideologies of white supremacy between the Nazis and, say, the early 21st century. But I have not had to look very far to find references to Greco-Roman antiquity in the major figures between, say, 1950 and 2011. William Pierce, the author of the Turner Diaries and the architect of American white ethno-nationalism of the second half of the 20th century. He wrote I think it's a 35-part essay on the history of the white race, starting with the atom. That's how far he traced the history of whiteness back to the primordial atom is the first case. But he's got chapter after chapter in that about Greco-Roman antiquity, the Dorian invasion, the Goths, so he's very interested in Greco-Roman antiquity. People like Willis Carto and Wilmot Robertson and George Lincoln Rockwell, these intellectual white nationalists, active neo-Nazis. I found references to the fall of the Roman Empire in their work. I found a quotation of Pindar in Wilmot Robertson. He's the person who popularized the idea ethno-state, for example. He talks about Pindar. So Greco-Roman antiquity, I think, was always there. They were probably also interested in the medieval period, for example. But I think in my book, I'm only going to be able to gesture toward this. By the way, Denise McCoskey, I know she's working on a project about Greco-Roman antiquity and the eugenics movement at the beginning of the 20th century. Like, this is an area where I think work is needed, sort of filling in the periods of history that are not the Nazis, and how Greco-Roman antiquity was used for hate all the way through. Like, we're pretty good, I think, on pro-slavery in the 19th century in the US. We're pretty good on Nazism and fascism, and there's, I think, a lot to fill in around that. So I don't know if that exactly answers your question, but that's kind of my sense, is that there's a lot of just unknown things there because these people haven't been studied that much from that point of view.
And it didn't need it. Maybe it didn't need to be engaged before civil rights stirred the embers in a way. And so, I mean, partly what got me into classics was Ben-Hur and the Kirk Douglas Spartacus, and those are very white movies. The only non-whites are either being crucified or carrying litters around. So that was just a given. It obviously didn't bother me when I was 12 years old. But anyway, Jackie Murray, the aforementioned, is with us.
Yeah, I don't want to make Jackie wait longer.
Right.
I know. Actually, I wanted to. Before I ask my question, I could add something to what you were just saying. The period that seems like we're studying it in my class, so this is why I think my class on Black classics is the period.
Jackie, just say who you are for the very few.
Jackie Murray, University of Kentucky, class 6. That's good enough. Yes, sorry. Just pick up what you were saying and then ask my question. I would say the period that needs the most exploration, and it's the gap that they're working with, is the post-Civil War Reconstruction up to the World War II. That period is the least understood, least studied, least explained for most students. And in fact, what's part of that gap is the lost cause narrative and all these other white supremacist narratives that were developed in that period. And a lot of them refer back to the classical era. This is also the late 1900s is the time period of the World's Fairs and the whole idea of Darwinism and the eugenics. Rebecca Fudo Kennedy is also working on this eugenics thing with Denise. Not with Denise, but two of them are doing the same kind of project. So it's actually, I would say it's a late 19th century into the first part of the 20th century, especially with the build up to Jim Crow. And then the civil rights era is what sort of triggers everybody to go into underground, right? Because it becomes not palatable to be as straightforwardly white supremacist after once the 60s start. So then they just go underground. But I think it's been a persistent narrative there. At least that's what my class is finding as we're looking at the interlocutors that Du Bois is working with in the first half of his career. So that
And
I
it-
would suggest that period.
Thanks for that. And it occurs to me I had a panel at the SDS this year on papers on white
Yeah.
white supremacist groups and classics. And just for the group, one of those papers was on the founding documents of the KKK, which I think was from that period too. And they're using Latin mottos and things too. So I think thanks Jackie for that. I think that's a really good point. Like that period of open white supremacy is really worth studying.
Oh yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. It is the period that needs to be studied because no one's ashamed of being white supremacist, right? And that's the dominant way of thinking. But so my question actually had to do with, so at the beginning you were mentioning the idea of the meta strategy of like cultural sort of indoctrination. And then there was a political strategy, right? And so my question is, well, what do you think the political strategy is? Because I have an idea in that I think that it is really in America, I won't speak to Europe or anything like that, but in America, it seems that the political strategy is to unravel the 14th Amendment, which is part of those Reconstruction amendments. The 14th Amendment is the one that gives, gives everybody the right to vote, Black men the right to vote, but also it's the foundation of the gay marriage rules or the legislation that just came by. So it seems to me it's all bound up in who's a citizen, who equal rights, all of that. Those are the amendments that so 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendment are the amendments that actually were sort of designed to create a more equal, egalitarian democracy in America, but they've been under attack ever since they were ratified. And I wonder if that's not, at least in America, if that's not a major part of what this is about in terms of where they're coming from.
So first of all, just thanks for that analysis, and it sounds really plausible to me. It makes me realize that, in my focus on the passages where they talk about Greco-Roman antiquity, I probably sometimes miss the bigger picture of what they're doing on these sites. So I think I don't know the answer to your question. If they've really concretely said what the political strategy is, I think in some ways, like the focus on metapolitics is a way of not talking in concrete ways about the political strategy. I haven't found anything that I can think of where they connect Greco-Roman antiquity to the 14th Amendment, for example. That doesn't mean they don't talk a lot about the 14th Amendment on their sites. They might just not be places where Greco-Roman antiquity comes up. So I'll look, and I'll follow up with you if I find anything. Let me just make a note here.
Yeah, because it seems like this discussion about who can count as a citizen.
Yeah, right. It's an obvious connection now that you make it. But what I will say is, the way they talk about the political goal, the person I'm thinking of is the editor of Countercurrents, who's a philosophy PhD, has taught philosophy in American colleges, has a 21-part lecture on Platonic dialogues posted on his site. He's always talking about metapolitics. And he's kind of one of these people who's like, it's kind of scary how smart he is. But his way of talking about it is the metapolitical project is going to be so successful that, in a sense, we won't need to worry about who's being elected, that pro-white policies will be enacted no matter who gets elected once our ideas have become so successful. So to that extent, he hasn't kind of like defined, this is what the actions that are going to be taken are. But what you've suggested seems like something they would be focused on.
Well, yeah, because what I'm thinking about is, so in this period, there was a metacultural, whatever, what do we call it? Meta strategy?
Metapolitical strategy, yeah.
Yeah, there was this strategy where with a lot of plays, but in particular, Thomas Dixon and his Leopard Spot and all of that, which ultimately in The Birth of a Nation, and also within the school system with the Daughters of the Confederacy, and also with the attempt to sort of unite the brotherhood of the North and the South under whiteness, right after the Civil War. There's a lot of like energy there, in sort of inculcating that into even in public schools levels, high school levels, whatever. So there was definitely a concerted effort to just culturally indoctrinate everyone into thinking that white supremacy was normal, was okay, and so I wonder if they're not just trying to get back to that, right? Because there's statements about like how what's wrong with saying what's wrong with the white ethno state, like these statements that the real overt white supremacists say, well, why can't I talk about white supremacy? What's wrong with that? Like these guys want to go back to where it's comfortable to speak like that, right? So anyway, I would like to know what you end up finding out about this, because my suspicion is that it's there, and that we're still fighting a long battle that's been going on since the Civil War.
Yeah, I think you're right. I mean, just hearing you lay out that history of the metapolitical strategy of that period, you're saying is the most interesting period, with the birth of the nation and the Daughters of the Confederacy and everything. It makes you really, I guess what I take away from it is just thinking about how effective that can be, right? How, those, just all the things that established that are still in place, so much longer. It makes you really realize, don't underestimate this metapolitical strategy, and what it can accomplish.
I would just jump in. We should. It seems to me, Jackie, that's absolutely right, and the unashamed ways in which not the far right, well, it is the far right, but it's the conventional right, is going about disenfranchising. I mean, in Georgia, a whole state, the representatives, something nakedly racist in its intent, given what happened in Georgia with the Senate elections, that since Obama, this has become legit. If it's legit to get nothing done because Obama's president, then it's legit to make sure that never happens again. So I want us to end, when we do end, with just asking Supratik's question, which I think is what Adrienne and I are hoping to do, is to think about constructive ways of what we do about it, assuming that it is a real it, which I think you wouldn't be here at 6:45 if you didn't think that, or you would have tried to bomb us by now if that were the case. But I think that we'll keep asking that question, and not from a perspective of any sort of shame or concealment or whatever, but from a very constructive point of view. So thank you, Supratik, for getting us started on that road. But meanwhile, Charlie, why don't you introduce yourself and ask us a question?
Great. Thank you so much for the talk, Curtis. If you don't mind if I use your first name, I'm a postdoctoral fellow in the classics department and in the history department. I also did my PhD in the classics department at Harvard. So, like you, seeing a lot of friends, of course. My question is we've analyzed the ways in which some of these political movements that you're so interested in are not solely American, of course. I mean, they have American characteristics in their expression in this country, but they tap into some larger phenomena happening in Europe and elsewhere. And I'd be curious, and this is a gigantic question, so apologies for that, but I'd be curious if you could characterize the contours of some white ethno-nationalist discussions of the classical world in Europe, for instance, or in South America. I mean, how do some of these narratives use the sources that you've identified here, and how do they? I mean, I think Suzanne's distinction between curation and distortion was really useful. I'd be quite interested to hear if you know about ways in which certain European groups that we'd find unpalatable use the classical canon as well, either in curation or distortion.
So I think the honest answer is that I'm much more familiar with the American context than the, say, European context or even the South American context. I get a lot of stuff across Twitter, people sending me things there's a kind of neo-fascist group in Brazil, I think, that uses a sigma as their symbol. This is an old group going back to the early parts of the 20th century. So there certainly are examples. And of course, there's many examples in Europe. I'm going to put in the chat here the name of a scholar, Tamir Bar-On, who's written a lot about white nationalism in Europe, and especially about the French New Right, which is the sort of movement that Alain de Benoit is about. So that's one place. He's one scholar that you could look at and work sort of related to that. So the thing, I guess the thing I can talk about is in Europe, there's it seems like there's a big anti-American strain in the nationalism there, talking about America as a sort of consumerizing or force in Europe that's taken away identity. America as the kind of like economic and cultural overlord that's destroyed European identity. And that kind of feels like a difference, I think, to us. But actually, it makes those thinkers very congenial to American white ethno-nationalists who regard current contemporary America as dominated by consumerist mentality that destroys identity and so on. So, the kind of anti-Americanism of the European movements, I think, fits very well with the American context. Another difference, which the American sites are very open about, because they're very interested in translating this work into an American context, is that actually America has greater free speech protections than the European movements have, and the American sites, they state that as the advantage they have over American movements. So that's a kind of just another thing I've noticed in that. I haven't done the work to find out if having a sort of geographical connection to the ancient world, changes the way you talk about its relevance to your politics. But in a sense, the area that I'm most familiar with are Britain and France, two places that aren't Greece or Italy. And so, not in exactly the same way as the United States, but in sort of parallel ways, has to sort of invent a connection with the classical culture, ironically, sort of through their own conquest by those cultures. They have to sort of invent it in a way that's maybe parallel to the way America has. So, those are the kind of thoughts I would have. Before we wrap up, though, too, I feel that this is related to Charlie's question. Suzanne did ask one thing earlier about what is the emptiness these people are trying to fill, and I sense that in connection to this idea of the anti-Americanism in the European movement, because Susanna, I don't know actually what emptiness they think classics fills, although I do think they use the language of ancestry and inheritance a lot. And so there is a kind of sense of antiquity connecting them to a period where white people were accomplishing great things, supposedly, and were thinking all the best thoughts and were so much more advanced than everyone. So that's part of it. But your way of describing it as an emptiness, I think, is really helpful, because in a sense, antiquity, I think, is interesting to them rhetorically, as I've said. I think if another period of history was as respected, they would be using that as much too. So I'm not sure there's anything specific to antiquity that fills their need. But one thing you do find in working on these sites is that they are playing on the disaffection of the neoliberal order, or whatever you want to call it. I don't feel totally confident talking about this, but one thing that's kind of surprising when you read these sites is how they're concerned with a lot of the things that liberals claim to be concerned with, like environmental degradation. They talk about income inequality a lot, actually, on these sites. They talk about reclaiming the cities. Now that's, of course, highly racialized, right? If the cities are designated as black spaces, like reclaiming the cities. But they are playing on the kind of malaise of modernity that I think goes beyond white nationalist politics, but is a sort of feature of what is sometimes called late capitalism. And so they see the ancient world, I think, as a you know, as one facet of imagining a world where they wouldn't have that malaise. But that malaise isn't something that they're inventing. They're playing on that just as much as they're playing on the respect of the ancient world to try to promote their ideas. And what your question made me think about is this book by Shane Burley. He's a journalist, a book called Fascism, What It Is and How to End It, which talks a lot about the sites and things that I've been talking about. And, you know, he makes the point, not as strongly as I would have liked, but it's in the book that, you know, one of the reasons these groups are getting traction is because, he says, the left has failed to really provide a response to the malaise of neoliberal late capitalism. That, you know, like the sort of corporatized left is just letting all those things continue in a way. And, you know, I don't really feel competent to evaluate that, but it sort of rings true to me, having been on the sites, that, you know, this is maybe not something that our expertise as classical scholars lets us respond to, but I do think that's part of the response to this movement in general, is to recognize that things like wealth inequality, things like environmental degradation, you know, all of these aspects are in fact driving the rise of, or the rise of this kind of white supremacy. There's another recent book out which I haven't read. I think it's called The Sum of Us, which is about how racism hurts everyone. And I'm sure a lot of people here have heard of this book. But, you know, again, sort of not dealing with racism actually, I think, helps the white ethno-nationalists in their case, because it allows them to kind of keep trading on sort of unstated beliefs in the dominant culture. And I do think classical antiquity is sort of bound up in that, but, you know, that I think is where their energy is coming from.
I was going to put a question about the weekend warriors in Britain, that is those centurions and legionnaires who march around the British countryside dressed as Roman soldiers, and the connection from that to Brexit, to the fantasy that they won World War II single-handedly and don't need anyone except their own white selves. And again, the anti-immigrant policies tied up in that. But I wonder whether that interest in Roman Britain plays into, you probably haven't looked into that, but it might be worth looking at that. And then we'll go to a question from our dear friend Kevin McGrath, who
I'll just say very, very quickly to that, Richard, a major anti-immigration site in this country called vdare.com has almost all of its classical content is focused on Roman Britain. I haven't kind of done the work to work through that, but it's definitely a topic they're interested in. Okay, yeah, Kevin, sorry. I think you're still muted.
You're mute, Kevin.
Thank you, Curtis, for a really interesting talk and for bringing up our consciousness as to what's going on. I was not aware of any of this happening here. I'm a Sanskritist and I study the epic Mahabharata. And in India today, and Sanskrit's the classical language of Northern India, you have these epic heroes and heroines still being worshipped. They're an important part of the political life, the social life, and not just the religious life. And the present government under Modi, which is essentially Hindutva or right-wing Hindu in form, manipulates this extraordinarily against the Muslim population who are outsiders, and also against the group who are at the bottom of the social scale, the Adivasis, used to be called the outcasts or the untouchables. So this classical formation, which has been the heart of Indian education for a long, long time, is being used politically. And in answer to Supratik's question, and Supratik is the generation which is going to be dealing with this problem, not so much our generation, you have incredible contention in institutes of higher education in India at the moment. People like Romila Thapar receive death threats. This is an extremely powerful antagonism which exists in education in Northern India, not so much in the South, which is different. So it's not so much a political problem, it's how cultures appropriate the past for their own advantage. And there's one point which we didn't discuss today. That was how the junta in Greece in the late 60s and 70s appropriated imagery and iconic vestiges from classical Greece to support their autocracy, their tyranny. And that contest was also displayed in institutes of higher education. And you had the riots at the Polytechnic, which ultimately brought down the junta. So what you've raised today, Curtis, raising our consciousness, if you like, is an extremely important point, and I'm very grateful for that. And as you say, what we have is our teaching. So that's just another dimension to this very interesting gathering.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks, Kevin. Thanks for your comment. I'm glad you found it interesting.
Well, it's 6:56, and we should probably draw things to a close. So let me, on behalf of Adrian Staley, and just thank all of you for coming. Such fantastic questions, suggestions, lines of inquiry, and again, I think we go back to Supratik. I hope you don't mind being the object of our focus, but what do we do? And I think, you know, we can make choices. Heads in sand is one, but but I think that what we do, some of the things that we do, Curtis Dosha has pointed us towards, and our own thinking. Again, I mentioned Jackie Murray, but a common sense that we are both supportive of the huge changes that we hope this country will continue to go through, but that classics has a place in that. Our cultures have a place in that, that is supportive of those tides and avalanches, which I think we all admire. And I'll stop my metaphor, but we'll turn to say thank you, Curtis, and I should say Jared Hudson, who was with you at Berkeley, as many others here were. Jared was the one who said, well, what about Curtis and Faraz? So I should credit Jared for that impulse, from which we have all profited this evening. So again, if you have ideas for this seminar, be in touch with Adrian Staley or myself, and we continue in the fall with Adrian himself and Riefenstahl and everything we can learn about a contemporary situation from that past. So thank you, Curtis, and happy end of semester to all.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks everyone for being here, and great conversation. A lot of great ideas. I really appreciate it.
And
have a great night, everybody.
And thanks to Allison finally for yet again a splendid poster and all of her help. So good night all.